Good morning, everybody. We are now linked into the first plenary meeting of our deliberative poll weekend. But before we start on that, can I first of all, my name is John Curtis. I am a professor of politics at the University of Strathclyde and also a senior research fellow at NatSen, who've been organising this weekend, and I'm, as it were, the person who's ultimately responsible for this research project. So first of all, a big welcome to you all from the research team, and particularly from myself. We're really grateful for you for getting involved in this weekend. And we hope, frankly, above all, that you enjoy the experience of being able to talk to each other about the various topics, about what Britain should do once it's left the European Union, and also from listening to some of the experts that we've assembled for you. So you've been talking about so far this morning about various questions about immigration, various policy choices that the UK is having to make once we leave the European Union on the 1st of January. And you've come up with a number of questions, and we have a couple of speakers for you who are going to attempt to address those. So first of all, let me introduce, we've got Ben Greening. Ben is the Executive Director of Migration Watch, which is an independent, non-political think tank that argues that Britain would benefit from a more sustainable and properly controlled level of migration. I hope that we're going to be joined later on by Sundar Katwala, but he's not appeared as yet. But if he does, Sundar is a director of British Future, which is an independent, non-partisan think tank that aims to address and assuage the concerns about identity and integration that people may have as a result of migration. And then thirdly, we have Madeleine Sumption, who is the director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. And the observatory provides impartial, independent evidence and analysis designed to inform the debate about immigration policy in the UK. So all of the various groups have come up with a range of questions that they would like to be addressed. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can, though I'll be honest with you, we may not succeed in going through all of them. But I thought we perhaps should start off with a question that both Gary's group and Ella's group have raised, which is, Madeleine, first of all, how much can we rely upon data collected about migration?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you will hear a lot of stories in the news saying, oh, well, we just know absolutely nothing. We have no idea. I definitely wouldn't go that far. I think we do in this country have some pretty good data about migration. We know, for example, that there are roughly in the order of 9 million people living in this country who were born in other countries. We know that at least before the coronavirus crisis hit, there were kind of around well, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 in net migration of people coming to the UK every year, and that's broadly consistent across data sources. A lot of what we don't know, where the kind of statistics tend to fall apart a little bit, is when we try and drill down into really specific questions. So things like, what share of international students who come to the UK are still here several years later. We have some idea of that, not very many in that case, but we don't have a really precise estimate. And the area where we know very little is irregular migration, illegal immigration. That is basically a data black hole. We don't really know how many people are living here without authorization to do that. We don't know how many people in total arrive every year without permission or overstay their visas. So it really depends a lot on which aspect of the immigration puzzle you're looking at.
Just a quick supplementary, Madeleine, before I come to Ben. What, if anything, do we know about the impact of coronavirus on the level of migration in the last 6 months?
We know that it's been absolutely massive. We've got a little bit of data from from over the summer, and we can see from that basically the immigration system ground to a halt after COVID. So you have almost no one being granted visas for, across the board for work, study, family, the main reasons that people come to the UK. We don't yet know whether it's picking up over the last few weeks, particularly in the kind of late summer when things started to open up a little bit. And I think, and there's a big question, this is not really data, but sort of prognosis about the future. It's very difficult to say at this stage how much of the impact of COVID will be long term. So for example, if the economy is not doing well, traditionally that's been associated with lower numbers of people coming to get jobs here for obvious reasons. There aren't as many jobs to be had. But it's very difficult at this point to say, how will family migration be affected? Will it bounce back as people who weren't able to come in start to be able to do that? Or, would there be some kind of long-term impact on the reduction of movement worldwide? That will really, have to wait another year or so before we get a clear picture.
Okay, I'm pleased to hear that Sunda's with us. Sunda, the question we're addressing, but I'm going to ask Ben to answer first, is about how much do we know about the data on migration so far? Ben.
Yeah, so Madeline was mentioning that we don't have a comprehensive picture yet about how COVID has impacted immigration, and I would completely agree with that. There's been some data from the Home Office about the change in visa applications in the year to June, and we do know that there was a 29% decrease in the number of total visas issued, including visitor visas. And study visas, work visas have all gone down, as have asylum applications. So that is an indication of what's happened. But I would say that this year especially represents a challenge for migration statistics, because we've got three sort of parallel contexts in which these statistics are evolving. On the first circle, we've got the fact that the survey that's been used since the 1960s to measure immigration is being scrapped, and that was already the plan anyway, to sideline that, but that COVID has meant that has been sort of accelerated. So that's one thing that's changing, and instead of using that survey at airports to measure immigration, it's going to use a great deal more administrative data, such as GP registrations, etc., to get a fix, and exit checks, for instance, to get a fix on what immigration is. And that, I would say, is a positive thing, but it also increases the challenge for transparency. And then the second circle I was referring to is also is the one we just mentioned, the COVID context, which obviously has a big impact on immigration, and we're still waiting to see what the full picture is. And then the third circle, which affects this, is the introduction of the whole new system from the end of the year. So that will impact on a lot of things, including the number of visas that are issued, obviously, and the way in which they are issued, the rules which govern that. So I would say that this is a particular period when we have to watch out for transparency and accountability in the way that immigration is measured and reported to the public. And I hope that the public will be able to have a clear picture of how the statistics from before this year marry up with those that come after.
Okay, all right. So Sunda, how much do you think we can rely on the data on migration?
Well, there have been challenges for the data, has just been mentioned. There have been very dramatic changes, obviously, because of COVID, and it'll be harder to measure what those are. What we do know is that in the short term, of course, net migration or migration has changed a lot and has collapsed almost completely in the very short term. We had some net migration statistics that were, above 300,000 a year right up to the moment of the pandemic. From jobs market data and other things, it's almost certain now that net migration is significantly negative in this immediate period. When we return to some kind of normality in 6 months' time, 9 months' time, what the new numbers are will depend on lots of things. If international students don't come this autumn, that will have a very big impact on the immediate number. So the first numbers we see, however good they are, might be quite different to where it settles down. We're in a very different economic context with a recession and rising unemployment, and we will have different policies next year and afterwards. So the kinds of numbers we've seen in the past, it will be very different in the very short term, and it will depend on a lot of different factors as to how that returns. The numbers are estimates because they capture people coming in for different reasons. Different people are allowing visas. The exit numbers have always been a lot shakier than the entrance numbers. So it was very difficult, for example, to count accurately the number of students who left, just because people who said they were coming in to do a degree, that wasn't necessarily caught on the way out, and that led to the government overestimating how many students were staying. So there's a lot of uncertainty about some of the data, and obviously there are specific issues around undocumented immigration and illegal immigration, but overall immigration has fallen a lot, but will return, but perhaps not to the levels we've seen.
Okay, thanks. Next question's a very broad one, but perhaps gets us to the heart of some of the more detailed issues that we've got to deal with later on. So, Ben, first of all, the question is there enough to go around in terms of housing and also the demand on public services in the UK? So I think the implication of the question is, to what extent is immigration a pressure on the housing supply in the UK and on public services? And that's a question that came particularly from Carissa's group.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. And it's something that our organization looks at specifically, because I'd say that our stance is summed up by 3 points, one of which is about the scale of immigration, which we say is has been too high. And the others, two of which are, one of which is that enforcement is decreasing, and that's a major problem because it means immigration is becoming more unfair in nature. And then thirdly, there's an accountability issue. But on the scale issue, just to give a sense of that and the churn of what it has meant, it's meant that 6.2 million net arrivals have occurred since 1997 by non-UK citizens. At the same time as we saw a net departure of about 1.4 million Brits overseas. And that does have an impact on the public services, and just in terms of the pressure it puts on them. There are other considerations which are often mentioned too, which is that many people obviously come in and work in the NHS and make a very valuable contribution there. So those things have to be balanced out. But just to look at that pressure, you can get an idea of it by looking at, for instance, GP registrations, new GP registrations by those from overseas. These in the last year, 2018-19, reached about 790,000. And that was the highest on record. And obviously COVID will probably impact that by reducing the number of arrivals. And obviously those registrations don't necessarily measure arrivals specifically, because some people can register twice and some short-term migrants might register. On the housing question, we have an idea of that from ONS housing projections. And the most recent one, which provided appropriate comparators, showed that over the next 25 years, England will have to build 240 homes per day just to cope with the level of immigration that was running, the average level of immigration at that time. So that's a significant number of homes that need to be built just to cope with immigration. And our point is that this has a huge impact, not just on the housing crisis, making it harder for people to save up for a deposit, own their own home, pushing up house prices, immigration has been found to do so. And also it has an impact in the need to build on green land, which we're not building more of. And so it's irreplaceable. And we'll keep losing that as long as we have a very high level of immigration into the country. So that's one of the arguments that we have to bring immigration down to more sustainable and sensible levels.
Okay, Sundar.
Housing is certainly an important impact in the immigration debate. I think most people think that immigration brings pressures that need to be managed and brings gains for the economy and for public services, and that you want to balance those two things. But probably housing is the biggest area where people are thinking about the pressure. What the statistics tend to show is that over time, if you choose to have immigration in your new control policy, it's contributing to about a half of the new housing demand, whereas about half of the new housing demand is coming from other aspects of population change in the domestic populations. That's really significant. If you're choosing to have immigration because people have got skills, you need them in the economy, you clearly need a policy to manage that well. And that's been one of the gaps, I think, in what governments have done. Another issue here is the distribution of population as well as the overall numbers. So this question looks different, I think, in London and the southeast than it does, for example, in Scotland. The population in Scotland was 5 million 30 years ago. It's still 5 million now, and so the government in Scotland has a policy, whereas it wants to maintain the population and have a steady increase. That will be good for Scotland, whereas in the south of England, you're seeing rising population, a strong economy. That can be good for the south of England if you've got plans in place to manage the pressures as well as the gains of immigration. With a new controlled system, the government actually has, decisions to make about how much immigration it's got. It has to decide how to use the resources that migration brings to provide housing and public services that manage it well and fairly for everyone.
Okay, Madeline.
Yes, I mean, I would definitely agree with Sundar that there is a difference here, I think, between public services and housing, quite a big one, in that there's much more evidence that immigration could be creating pressures in the housing market than there is in public services. So on the housing side, immigration is a pretty big contributor to population growth. Now, most economists actually think that doesn't matter too much. There isn't really a way of defining what the right amount of population is, or how many people we can fit in. Different places are much more densely populated than others, and overall, it doesn't seem to have a big economic impact. In the housing market, though, it can increase pressure on housing, and particularly then it lead to an increase in prices. Now, that obviously depends how many houses you're building. In this country, we typically haven't built enough houses to keep up with demand, and there is some evidence that immigration has been one of the factors that contributes to increases in the cost of housing, particularly in areas that have more restrictive planning policies, where it's more difficult to build new houses. So there, I would definitely say there is some evidence of pressures as a result of migration. On public services, I would say, generally speaking, less so. That counterintuitively, actually, it seems like immigration hasn't had a huge impact, at least in kind of medium and long term. The main reason for that is, well, there are two things, basically. Migrants pay taxes that then are used to fund the public services that they use. They don't tend to be massive users of many public services, NHS being the classic example, because they tend to be a bit younger. And in many cases, they're contributing as part of the workforce. So here, I would say overall, not a huge impact. It will vary, of course, depending on which public service you're looking at. So in education, you're more likely to see pressures because you have migrants coming in. Many of them are young, so the age people are having children. Their children will go to school, and that's a relatively large contributor to the school population. In the NHS, I think it's pretty difficult to make a strong argument that that migrants are creating a lot of pressure on the NHS, given that they make up a pretty big share of the workforce of doctors and nurses, and because they're younger, tend not to be using it anywhere near as much as we would expect from the UK-born population.
Okay, right. Well, that's got us into some of the broader issues, but let's now come into some of the more specific questions that the participants have been asked to think about, and where they've come up with some questions. Let me just perhaps try and put together, first of all, a couple of questions that have been raised about skills. So one of them is essentially, well, what is classified as skilled versus unskilled? And How does this compare with what happens in the Australian system? And both Helen's group and Andy's group raised that question. And then a kind of equally relevant cognate question: how would the government successfully identify areas of needs in the workforce? So this is really a question about how do we decide which workers we do need, as opposed to those workers that we don't need, and to what extent is that a question of skill? So, Sunda.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a very good question. I think people often talk about the Australian point system and a skills-based approach, and the government has talked about it as something that we'd like to do. I mean, if you're then devising a British skills system, it will be a different policy from the one Australia has got. I mean, one of the key factors about Australia, while I think it has a strong reputation for getting the skills it wants to choose, it was always a very pro-immigration policy in Australia, that the Australian system was designed to welcome immigration and then choose the people that you're welcoming. Canada does something similar. It wasn't a system to try and keep the numbers down so much as get the people that you did want. And so, you know, net migration rates in Australia are higher compared to the population than they are in the UK, but you have this reputation for, you know, being selective about what you want. The government has the Migration Advisory Committee looking at these questions. I mean, what we've tended to do in this country is use salary level as the kind of thing the policy is being designed around, as much as the skills that you want. But the Migration Advisory Committee has been looking at a thing called the shortage occupation list. Where are there people that you would need, skills that you would need, where they're not necessarily high salary jobs? And the specific area where this is most important, I think, is social care, where they made an announcement last week that they would want some senior care workers, but that's probably only a tenth of the social care workforce. Social care seems to be an area where there's quite a strong case, especially in the short term, for having migration. If you want the system to go where people aren't going to be being paid £26,000, you would then want a policy that said, what are the pay rates for domestic social care? What are the training and progression things? But you can't switch that on overnight. And so if we don't allow people to come in to do care work, we're going to hit quite a big problem probably in the next year or two. And so we need a balance of our training and skills policy and our migration policy. So there's a skills level, there's a skills framework that, you know, certain people pass and certain people don't, and that it's a lot of mid-skill jobs that I think the tricky issues are around. Primary school teachers, teaching assistants, senior care workers, jobs like that are on the boundary. So while people talk about high skill and low skill, there's a lot of skills in the middle as well.
Madeline.
This is a very good question, and it's actually surprisingly difficult to answer because there isn't really a single definition of what counts as skilled or unskilled, and different people have different things in mind. So some definitions of skills are based on the education that someone has. So do they have a university degree? Do they have vocational qualifications for, you know, in areas like, you know, construction, hospitality? And there's never, you can kind of construct various cutoffs, but they're all going to be somewhat artificial. There isn't necessarily a point at which someone moves from being unskilled to being skilled. And even jobs that can be referred to as unskilled, they do require skill. They may not be the kinds of skills that require, you know, months of or years of training, but they might be things like, you know, soft skills, communication skills, caring skills, particularly in the example of social care. So this, I think, this is a question. It's one of these things that it's really difficult. Governments have to put a definition in somewhere if they're going to say, here's our policy for skilled workers. In general, most countries, including the UK, tend to take a kind of broader definition of skills, so combining various factors, including, you know, potentially the education that someone has, the type of occupation that they're doing, the salary that they earn, in many cases their language skills on top of that. And from a policy perspective, the main decision basically is kind of what combination of those things do you think is important? I wouldn't say there's a single answer to that. In terms of identifying skills in the, what the skills needs are in the workforce, this is incredibly difficult. And the one kind of note of caution that I would suggest is that you shouldn't assume that experts can, go and tinker with the data and tell you exactly what we need. That it's always going to be a matter of judgment. Different methodologies will produce different answers. Reasonable people will disagree. And so there isn't a kind of technocratic solution to this, just kind of, well, ask the economists what we should do and then do that. It really does end up being about political and kind of broader policy judgments, unfortunately. Most countries kind of get around that by, instead of saying, okay, we need, 1,000 engineers and 2,000 nurses or what have you, instead of trying to micromanage in that way, which actually is technically pretty challenging, they tend to rely to some extent on employer demand. Just say, okay, well, employers will tell us who they want to hire. We'll put some constraints on that. They're not going to be able to hire anyone that they want. They're going to have to meet some criteria, but basically it's the employers who identify what the skills needs are. That's traditionally been the UK approach, and that's what most countries, high-income countries around the world do. What's slightly different about Australia is that they do a little bit more of the micromanaging. So they have a more government-led approach where they're a little bit more confident about their ability to decide exactly how many people they want in different occupational categories, for example. And I would say the government in general has a kind of heavier hand in deciding who comes in and who doesn't. Very difficult to tell what the overall impacts of that are in terms of, does that lead to better outcomes for people 10 or 20 years later? I would say we basically don't really have the evidence on that at the moment.
Okay, I should say the question about particular identified need came from Marie's group. Ben, I guess kind of an interesting supplementary as you respond to the broader question is, I mean, how good or bad or job do you think that the Migration Advisory Committee, which, as Madeline said, is the body that is responsible for advising the government, how good or bad a job do you think it's done so far in the recommendations it's made to government, in which the government so far at least has tended to be inclined to follow?
That's a good question, thank you. So that's a particularly relevant question when it comes to the skill level of jobs, because the MAC did advise that the government, the Migration Advisory Committee, the official expert committee on migration, they advised that the government should loosen the skills threshold for what essentially would be allowed to, an employer would be allowed to bring in a worker from abroad using what's a skilled work permit. And that's a big change that's going to come into effect in just a few months' time. So before it was jobs that are skilled to the level of a graduate level or above, and that is being changed to A-level, equivalent of A-level or above. And that's something that we've criticized, and we're not in favor of that, because as we said recently, actually, we released a paper just listing what these middle skilled jobs which are going to be exposed are, and that amounts to, in our calculation, 3 million full-time jobs held by UK-born workers in these decent middle-paying jobs, which are going to be opened up to direct global recruitment, and with no limit on it, with no cap on it, which Australia does have, at a time of rising unemployment. And we said that was a bad move. We don't support it. Generally, I think the MAC is a very impressive body, and they released a very comprehensive report a few days ago about shortage occupations, and it makes a very good case for suggesting that a lot of occupations such as butchers, secondary school foreign language teachers are in shortage. But one of the questions which the MAC does need to consider is whether immigration is the correct solution to filling those jobs. And what we say as an organization is that ideally our immigration system should allow employers to attract workers for jobs only if these roles cannot be carried out by Brits. And the fact is, many of these jobs could be filled by those who are already in the UK. 4 million who are underemployed even before the pandemic. And especially at a time of rising unemployment, the government's at risk of making a very big mistake in opening up these jobs, when the better response would be to increase training and support and incentivize employers to provide much better wages and conditions to attract British workers into these roles.
Sundar, you wanted to come back in or something?
Yes, when Ben's talking about a loosening of policy, it's worth just thinking about what the reasons are for that and whether it's a loosening or a tightening. Basically, since the 1970s, we've had European freedom of movement, which means that for one group of people coming to this country from the European Union, people can come and take any job at any skills level. And so we designed an immigration and skills policy for the rest of the world that knew that we were part of the European Union. And so it was quite restrictive in terms of graduate skills and so on, because there was this big European pool. So there's now a policy to say, well, that was quite tight. It's only graduates. They're the only skills we need from outside Europe. So the policy is going to be considerably tighter for people coming from Europe, but looser than the previous non-EU policy, because now it's a global policy. And so there are pressures from both sides. If you applied the non-EU policy, you'd really have a very tight immigration policy that wouldn't let any mid-scale jobs in. And so that's why it's both a tighter policy and a looser policy at the same time, because it's trying to have one policy for all regions.
Ben or Madeline, do any of you disagree with this? Is that a fair characterization, or shall we move on?
I would say that the loosening for non-EU countries is more significant in a way because it applies to 80% of the world's countries, which is a much larger pool of people who can come into such jobs at lower skills levels, as I said, and from countries which have much lower relative wages. So there's much greater incentive to come to the UK. And with no cap on it, that's a major risk, which I would say the government's taking.
Yeah, I'll just chip in. With all of this discussion of the Migration Advisory Committee, I think it would probably be remiss of me not to mention that I am a member of that committee, although I'm definitely not speaking in that capacity today. I'm here in my capacity from the Migration Observatory. On this question of tightening or loosening, and I would say that it is very much a case of, some bits are tightening, some bits are loosening. So the new system will be more restrictive, much more restrictive for EU citizens, and somewhat less restrictive for non-EU citizens. Overall, I would say the policy package that we have next year is very much a more restrictive one than the one now, even despite the fact that that things are being loosened up for non-EU citizens, partly because actually so much of immigration over the last 10, 15, 20 years has come from EU countries. So yeah, I would, there's some uncertainty about how many people will come in from non-EU countries, but overall, one would expect it to lead to a more restrictive policy and fewer people coming than we would otherwise have seen.
Okay, so as you will have gathered, even when the experts might agree about the facts, they won't necessarily agree about the implications, and that's obviously something for you all to think about. Can I now come to a couple of much more specific issues, and perhaps we could just deal with them relatively quickly. They come from both Amanda and Monique's group, and they're very specific questions about skills, etc. So one is, does the new point system to be introduced apply to seasonal workers? So that's one question we're looking for information on. And the second is, how is short-term and temporary migration currently defined? So maybe Madeline, do you want to deal with that first?
Sure. So the answer on does the new points-based system apply to seasonal workers is no. There is a separate scheme, a work permit-based scheme for people to come in those jobs. So the new points-based system is for people who are potentially able to stay long-term and may eventually, if they meet the criteria, be able to settle and become citizens in the UK. Seasonal workers are just coming for a few months and then they're required to leave. On the question of how short-term and temporary migration are currently defined, in statistics, the government statistics define this using a 1-year cutoff. So if someone's planning to come for less than a year, then they would be defined as a short-term migrant. And if it's more than a year, then they wouldn't. That's just a kind of a statistical, you have to have an artificial cutoff somewhere if you're going to put a particular duration on it. From the perspective of government policy, there actually isn't really a definition of what's short or long term. You basically have lots of different visa types. As I mentioned, seasonal workers, that person may only have permission to come in for a few months. There'll be other types of visas where someone's given permission for 2 to 3 years. But then they'll have, in many cases, the opportunity to extend that to switch onto a new visa, and then after a certain amount of time, usually somewhere in the range of 5 to 6 years, depending on which visa they came in on, they might be able to then get permanent status here. So from a policy perspective, you actually don't really need a definition. You just need to decide how long specific types of visas are going to be granted for.
Okay, Ben?
Yeah, well, we've considered short-term migrants to be those moving between countries for less than 12 months, simply because the definition, the UN, I think, definition of a long-term migrant is someone who comes for more than a year. But that's a big added element in terms of all the other statistics which are being measured, and it does adds uncertainty, and especially in the context of free movement, we saw discrepancies between the numbers who were coming for short periods and longer periods. And I'll be very interested to see how the new system, which comes on stream this year, deals with short-term immigration. Yes, on seasonal workers, there has been a provision in place for a few thousand people, I think, since late last year, to come in mainly from, I think, coming from countries such as Ukraine, and working on farms in the UK. That is, there's, we support that. That's something that's necessary to basically ensure that British fruit is picked, because it is very hard to find Brits to do those jobs, given their seasonal nature and the difficulties in transportation. We also do say, though, that more could be done by producers to improve conditions and do possibly more to attract UK people, such as students, to do horticultural jobs too. So the same argument applies for that need to really invest in the UK workforce and build up our skills and our investing in our talent in the UK.
Okay. Sundar.
Yeah, as the others have said, the seasonal work is a separate scheme. I think it's very important when we have that separate scheme that we have the rights and responsibilities of the employers to deal with the local impacts, the housing issues, etc. Because if that's going to work as a separate scheme, that's an important thing to cover. This point system we've got, it's quite a simple system, really. It's perhaps got less things in it than people might expect. You're going to need 70 points. And then 50 of them you have to have English language at a certain level. Your employer has to be registered as an employer that's allowed to sponsor these visas and so on. And then the question really becomes, do you get the last 20 points or not? And the ways to get that are to be doing a job above the skill level that pays £26,000, or to be a slightly lower number if you're a younger worker, or to do a job that doesn't pay £26,000, but where we're making a special exemption because of shortages. That's what you could do with, say, social care, if you chose to do it, or having a PhD or something. So really, we're saying we're quite open to jobs that are paying £26,000, and that there has to be a special reason to let you in if it's a job that doesn't pay £26,000. And that's the main feature of the point system. It's not got quite as many categories as people might expect.
Okay, Madeleine, just a quick follow-up, and you may hate me because you may just not have the answer at the top of your head, but let me just try it. Roughly speaking, how many seasonal workers a year does the UK admit, and is it correct to assume that they all go back again at the end of the season?
Well, currently, most seasonal workers are actually from EU countries, and so they're not kind of admitted, as it were, at all. They come and go under free movement. The data aren't great on this, but there are various estimates that suggest it's in excess of 60,000 people, compared to, I think, are at a cap of around 10,000 currently on the seasonal workers piled up for people coming in from non-EU countries. Well, at the moment, basically, seasonal workers don't need to go home, so we're not tracking that. Under the future system, we'll find out, hopefully.
Okay, all right. Now let's move on topic, and it's a subject a number of groups have raised. So Angela's group, Marie's group, Claire's group, Helene's group. A couple of cognate questions. So first of all, the question is, how easy is it for people from the UK, the European Union, outside the EU to access welfare benefits currently? And secondly, what determines the amount of time that people have to wait? Why is it 5 years, and doesn't this seem to be quite a long period of time? So Ben, why do people, what are the rules? Why is it 5 years? What should the rules be in future?
Sure. Yes, so that was a key issue in the EU referendum, actually, wasn't it, in the 2016 referendum? And one of David Cameron's aims in the renegotiation that occurred just before the referendum was whether migrants from the EU should be able to access a wide range of benefits, regardless of whether there was any contribution or not. And what we had seen was EU migrants, or a portion of EU migrants coming in and taking poorly paid jobs, and then able to claim a wide range of cash benefits, including particularly tax credits, child benefits, housing benefit, which could amount to many thousands a year per family, far outstripping that family's tax contributions. So that was a major issue that was in the referendum, and the government has proposed essentially evening the field. So after this year, then the requirement will be for people to have to wait 5 years before claiming benefits, whether they're from the EU or from outside the EU.
Ben, could you give people some idea of how many EU citizens were known to be claiming welfare benefits?
I can't give the number, but I can give the number of people, but I can give a number of the size of the bill, which looked to be, for EU migrants alone, was nearly 5 billion. And so that's a sizable amount of money. So it does seem fair to introduce a rule which means that people have to wait 5 years and to contribute a certain amount of taxes, essentially, before being able to claim those benefits. And what is true is that some migrants may pay very large amounts of tax indeed, but that is simply just not an argument for letting anyone in and everyone in the hope that it works out, because it's not really focusing on the best and brightest. It's more of a kind of a free movement policy, which was basically no control. And so it's good to have that control brought in. We would like to see more detail on what the government's plan is on that.
I should say that my supplementary question is also something that Sarah and Katie's group wrote. So, Sundar, can you, what do we know? What are the rules currently about access to benefits? Why is it 5 years, etc.?
So I think the way to think about the issue of benefits and public services is to realise as well that we would put different things on a spectrum as to what people should have access to when. And so, for example, if you come to this country and you are working, but you're a family, people don't think you should wait to some years before your child is eligible to go to the local school. They think that your child should be eligible to local school and that you should be able to use the health services. The things where you would have a waiting period would be out of work benefits if you lose your job, and particularly access to social housing. I think an interesting question is things like tax credits and so on, because if you make people wait for those, you've got potentially a perverse incentive where people doing the same job next to each other aren't receiving the same pay, and it might be, that might distort who gets employed for those roles. So on the whole, the aim is to treat people fairly as contributing once they're here to contribute, but to say that to receive certain things, for example, to join housing lists and so on, you need a connection to the local area. So that's why those things would be more like 4 or 5 years. I think Madeline might have the actual employment and unemployment rates. EU migrants a bit less likely to be unemployed and more likely to be employed, and that relates to the kinds of people who decide to come and the fact that if people don't have work, they might go home as well as stay around. So the unemployment rate is lower, but that, as Ben is saying, that doesn't mean you don't care about the principles by which you treat people. So it takes 5 or 6 years to be a British citizen. And I think most people have the view that once you've been here 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, you should have the same access to all the other people you're living with, including the chance to become a citizen. But there are certain benefits, out of work benefits and social housing where you want to have contributed, and certain services which you should have access to because you're here and you're part of our community.
Okay, Madeline, I wonder perhaps particularly you could clarify for us what's been the position up to now for EU citizens in particular, as opposed to the difference for non-EU citizens. And again, you know, is 5 years internationally a typical length of time before you allow citizens to be able to gain access to welfare? And then let me just also then sort of chip in, because it's also something raised by Dominic's group. You know, what's the position of migrants and refugees with respect to using the NHS, and how is this going to change in future?
Sure. So the situation is very different for non-EU and EU citizens currently. Non-EU citizens, broadly speaking, can't claim benefits, although there's some things that they may be eligible for as part of a family. If, for example, they're married to a British citizen who's eligible for family-based tax credits, for example. For EU citizens, they're eligible for most benefits, with some minor restrictions for people who've just recently arrived. And there's, as Sunda mentioned, I mean, unemployment rates, well, let's put coronavirus aside, unemployment rates for EU citizens have been very low, much lower than for Brits. And so they're much less likely to claim out of work benefits than British people. They are more likely to have been claiming, if you look at the last several years, more likely to have been claiming in-work benefits that you get basically if you're on a low income, gets topped up by the government. And that's basically because there is a larger share of EU migrants who are working in low wage jobs. One thing to think of when you're thinking about what that period should be of restrictions, it's interesting to note that actually even EU citizens who were eligible for benefits across the board, the large majority weren't claiming them. The data aren't great on this, but it's definitely more than half, probably significantly more than that. It actually increases over time because people are much more likely to be eligible if they have children, for example, which is more the case when they've been living here for a few years, have established themselves, and have children, rather than people who come more likely to be young and single. In terms of the kind of what's normal amount of time, this really just varies a lot by country. And one of the key questions is how long does it take for someone to get permanent status? So in general, once someone has permanent status, and certainly once they have citizenship, they would be eligible for everything in the way of welfare benefits. There are some countries that restrict it. So the US has a restriction for the first 5 years, even after you've got permanent status, but that's quite unusual. Somewhere like Australia, people are going to have access to benefits actually a lot sooner, because they can get permanent resident status much sooner than in the UK.
Okay, that's a nice segue into another set of questions about citizenship and residence that various groups have raised. There are 2 or 3 of them here, which perhaps we could cover between us. And they come from Gary's group, Marie's group, and Hannah's group. So it's been observed that the national life in the UK test, and you might like to explain for folk what that is, seems to be somewhat inappropriate, and could it be made more appropriate? What help is currently given to people to learn to speak, read, and write English? And why is it so expensive to apply for citizenship at the moment? So Madeline, would you like us to kick off with those questions? Do you want me to repeat any of them? Or have you...
Yep, no, that's fine, thank you. So the Life in the UK test, this is an interesting thing. I mean, a lot of countries have introduced these tests over the last 20 years or so. And actually, it's a real challenge trying to work out what should be in them, because so there are basically different schools of thought. One is like, let's make this really practical. Let's make it about people's ability to do day-to-day things. And then people look at the questions.
Madeline, could you just explain what the Life in the UK test is?
Sorry, yeah. So this is what's kind of in the academic literature referred to as a civic integration test. So someone, if you want to become if you're a non-EU citizen, you want to become a permanent resident, or if you want to get citizen as a citizenship, either as an EU or non-EU citizen, then you would have to pass this test. And it's basically a multiple choice test in which people are asked various questions about life in the UK, and that the current UK version can be anything from, what happened in the Wars of the Roses, to how do you register for a GP, those sorts of things. So there's a huge range of different types of questions that are in there. Now, there's a challenge, if you make the questions too practical, about how to access services and that kind of thing, they seem a little bit trivial. And people say, well, actually, shouldn't we really be asking what really matters? Is things like, do people share British values, or do they understand democracy and the rule of law in the UK, or that kind of thing. The problem with that is that then it's actually really difficult to assess whether someone actually shares British values, however you would define British values, and different people will have different views on that. And you end up maybe just it being a question of who's learned the correct answer to this question, and not you can't really use this test to look inside the soul of the person and see whether you agree with them. So I think there's probably no right answer in that, but I would be interested to know. I'm sure that Sundar and Ben may have views. In terms of what help is given to learn English. Not a huge amount initially, for various complicated reasons, including the fact that if you're not eligible for welfare benefits, and therefore some of the services provided through job centres, there may be some barriers to accessing English language classes that even if in theory they might be available. But there are some NGOs providing services of various different kinds. And then the question, why is citizenship so expensive? This is, it is not because of the cost of processing the application. So citizenship costs more than £1,000 per applicant, 1,300 for a standard kind of adult registration, a certain adult naturalization. And it's only a few hundred in actual cost to the government to process that. The rest is, well, depends how you define it. Some people would say the rest is profit. Other people would say that the rest is meeting the costs of the immigration system, so migrants contributing to the overall functioning of the immigration bureaucracy, enforcement, and so forth. So, so that raises the question, what should it cost? And I think that really comes down to basically, should you be trying to make it as easy as possible for people to get citizenship and just kind of maybe have them contribute to the actual cost of processing? Or is it fair to have migrants contribute to the cost of other things that may or not be relevant to them, the rest of the borders and immigration system?
Okay, Sundar.
Yeah, so these are great questions. I think the citizenship test is easy to mock because what's in it is a bit crazy, because if you got people off the street and asked them to do it, 8 out of 10 people would fail the test that we're giving to new citizens to pass, but new citizens do pass it because they read the handbook and learn the answers and so on. It'd be better to ask people to learn the answers of things that the rest of us knew. There were quite obscure questions about what year laws were passed about, the rights of women to inherit property and something that nobody would know. I've been doing some experiments with this, bringing together people who've done it with British-born citizens to try and do it. The people who are British-born are quite glad that the people who've been through it are there, because they've now got a better grasp of the history. But what's quite interesting is the people who've been through it think it's quite useful to have a guide that tries to bring it together, that you actually go through. In the end, we're testing people's language skills as much as anything else with this kind of exercise, but I think it could be a lot better. There's an underlying point here which relates to the cost question, which is the British government, I think, is making a mistake. It doesn't actually have a policy or a view about citizenship, whether it's a good thing to encourage people who are in this country long term to become citizens, because that's good for them joining the society, it's good for everybody else, or whether it's completely neutral, or whether it would rather people didn't really do that. And on the whole, the cost has gone up because the government doesn't really have a view that this is a good thing for people to do. It's happy to make it difficult and expensive and to gain some money from people who want to do it rather than to encourage people to do it. I think we should shift towards saying, obviously it's a thing you decide to do and it's not right for everybody, but we would encourage it. And in Canada, Australia, other countries, you do it. The cost, I think, arises from that. £1,300 for an adult, £1,000 for a child. So £5,000 for a family of 4. That's quite high. And you could become Australian and American and French and Canadian, all for the cost of a British citizenship application, because in the end, I think the government's seen it as a way to just take money from people who are going to do it, rather than to say, actually, this is good for you and good for us. So I think thinking about the cost, so maybe it was, you know, £500 for adults and children were free when they were coming as part of a family, would be a good signal to say, actually, we'd like to encourage this. And there are rules and responsibilities. You have to have good English to do it. You do have to find some things out about our history and our country, because it's the willingness to do that that shows that you're interested in the society that you're joining. And so we found that the people who've been through the process thought it was meaningful, liked the ceremonies, liked the pictures of the Queen, liked the fact that there was some rites of passage about it, even if British born people were saying, I'm not sure I'd know the answers myself.
Ben.
Yeah, I agree with Sundar that it's a mistake for the government not to have a policy on that. But perhaps I'd approach it from a slightly different angle in terms of how I think how hard it should be for someone to become a citizen. I do think the government should be encouraging people to become citizens, but I also think perhaps it's become too easy to become a citizen. I just compare it to, well, Switzerland requires new migrants from outside the EU to be living there for 10 years before they can apply for permanent residence to settle. We have 5 years here, and then after another year you can apply for citizenship. There's questions about how hard it should be related to the question about how valuable you consider citizenship to be. And citizenship is really the gateway into the demos that is the body of people that has a primary role in determining which laws are enacted via voting at the ballot box. That concept of citizenship is vital in setting out the parameters of what counts as our national community, our culture, identity, for instance. And I would say perhaps you can make a distinction between citizens and non-citizens as being the equivalent of someone who owns or rents a house and someone who is a guest in that house. And so I think perhaps citizenship should be harder to obtain because it is so valuable. And you could look at a various number of ways in which to make it harder, to increase the value of that citizenship. And you could do that on the basis of values, as Madeline mentioned values, but I would suggest that that should be part of the test. I'd say that the test the citizenship test that was being raised before, that's a good thing, that's a necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's definitely a good thing to have. My partner will be doing it in a few years and he's already studying, but you could also have criteria on which to test people's dedication to the country. That might include English language. Specifically, it might include values. You could discuss how to do that. It might include contribution. There is already a contribution requirement, for instance, to people apply for settlement if they're on a work visa of 35,000 a year salary. You could introduce that to the citizenship test. And of course, citizenship is important because it's linked to that question of integration as well, which is just one way of describing the process that happens when newcomers get sort of absorbed into that national community. And I guess I would agree with Edmund Burke, who called our constitution an entailed inheritance derived to us from our forefathers. and something that needs to be transmitted to posterity. And immigration that allows that successful absorption into a national community and that welcoming into that organic whole is really good and can be very good. But immigration that's much too quick and on too high a scale and too fast a pace can disturb that fundamental living organism, which is the product of our national and collective inheritance. So that's the question of citizenship is actually probably the most important question that we discuss when it comes to immigration.
Sundar, if you wanted to come in, if you just
Yes, look, Ben and I agree on quite a few things there about the importance of this. Where I would disagree is the idea that, especially right now at this moment of Brexit, that the way to make citizenship special is to actually make it harder or to make it less accessible. We should do the opposite. Europeans have been much less likely to become British citizens than, say, people from India or people from around the world because of the European Union. And you know, the rules of the European Union. And so we've got this scheme called settled status. I think we all agree that the people who've already been here must be welcome to stay. And so they've applied for permanent residence that isn't citizenship. And they have to have a clean criminal record and they have to have been in the country 5 years. And then we're saying there's a 1-year wait before you can apply for citizenship again. And then we're going to have a very big group of people who are committing permanently to be in this country and aren't citizens. And I think the Prime Minister should be writing to every one of them. So if you're committing to being in our country permanently, please think about becoming a citizen. That's the right thing to do at this particular moment in our history. So we should be making it more accessible. You have to have been here 5 years already. You have to pass the language test and so on. So it's quite stringent, but we particularly should be saying we welcome it. We're not neutral. Please do it if it's right for you. Ben,
do you want to come back on that at all quickly, or can I move on? My next question will give you a chance to be honest.
Okay, I'll leave it
to respond anyway. So here's a couple of kind of questions I'm going to put together as a kind of final wrap up part of our session. So one flows immediately from what we've just been talking about. It comes from Hannah's group, and it is about, you know, what does current research show and suggest about the success of current migration policy so far as integrating people into the UK is concerned. And then can I link to that cheekily a broader final question from Crescenzo's group, which is, what do you see as being the future of migration into the UK? And what do you think is going to happen to UK migration policy in the course of the next 5 years or so as we gradually learn to have our own migration policy? So it's a partly retrospective question. How good so far has what we've been doing been integrating migrants into our society? And secondly, where does migration go from here? Ben.
Well, on integration, I just mentioned it, and I did agree with Sundar that we should be encouraging as many people as possible to apply for citizenship. And I suppose it's a different point to make that then you have the question of how you actually become a citizen, which is different. But on integration, that's a very important question, and there are some warning signs there. I actually think Britain is a very well integrated place, and from my own experience, I live in North London. It's a place where everyone rubs along shoulders with everyone else, and it's a safe and peaceful community, and I love it. There are issues that have been warning signs that have been raised by experts such as Dame Louise Casey, who I think it was in 2016, she warned about some areas of the UK struggling to cope with the pace and scale of change. Many people, according to some polling, for instance, by the Demos think tank, found that people felt high immigration was creating divisions in society. And Dame Louise mentioned that the UK, she felt, was sleepwalking into an increasingly segregated society. And so there's a lot of food for discussion there. And that's a question of, it points to the question of how we deal with the very large scale immigration of people who are coming from very divergent, in some cases, very divergent cultures from the UK. And our opinion as an organization is that too many people coming too quickly makes problems for cohesion, potential problems for cohesion. So that is something that has to be borne in mind, especially in light of the very high numbers of people that have come since the late 90s. It's a question of how fast and how successfully the UK can cope with such a huge amount of change at that pace.
Okay, thanks. Sundar, a couple of minutes, please, Sundar.
I think integration is really important, because I think we have confidence in immigration when we're doing well on integration, and we don't when we're not doing it. We've got a mixed record. My parents came to this country 50 years ago from Ireland and from India, and certainly when I was growing up, people would say, you know, could people from Indian backgrounds feel British, or people who are black feel British? And we've come a long way on those questions, but we've never really put any work into it. We've never really had a policy to promote integration, contact between schools, making sure we've got mixed schools and so on. It's happened over time because people have done it, but it hasn't been proactive enough. So I think we should change that and be more proactive. If there are, you know, 1 million people who've come from Poland, many people have stayed here, and lots of them are having children who are British born, we want those children to feel pride in being British, as well as to feel that they've got a Polish heritage, and policies like citizenship can make a difference. So the future of immigration policy, it's very unpredictable now. Brexit, COVID, the economy, it's never been less predictable. Where we've got a big opportunity, I feel, is that we've had a very noisy debate where we've heard from the loudest voices, and people have said we're not allowed to talk about it, or we're really worried about people talking about it in the wrong way. And are you for it or against it? And when we get to the questions we're having now about our future policy, it's not are you for it or against it, it's how do we manage it well? What do we choose to have? How is economic migration, family migration, refugee protection? How do we have control and contribution and compassion in an immigration system? And I think people who've got different instincts about change being fast and good, change being worrying, can come together on the choices we make about these different policies, and we can find a lot more common ground on an issue that's been very polarizing than a lot of people think that we can.
Okay, Madeline, how well have we been doing, and where does immigration go from here?
Well, since we're relatively short of time, I'm just going to focus on the second of those, the future of migration to the UK. And I think, I mean, I don't like making predictions about the future, because predictions are always wrong. But I'm going to say I do think that that migration is still going to be substantial, at least after COVID recedes. You know, the next year or so is anyone's guess, to be honest. But once the new system has bedded down, and you know, looking forward to a world where COVID is no longer a thing, I think that the UK is still going to be a country of relatively high levels of migration, just for various structural reasons. There's so much demand for people to come here, and I think that the post-Brexit policy will be more restrictive as a package, and that will have some impacts, but it's not. My kind of guess would be it's not going to be a total game changer in terms of what does the day-to-day experience of British people of immigration look like in this country. In terms of how migration policy will change, what will happen to migration policy, my prediction here is that it will be unstable. I think we'll see a fair amount of change in immigration policy, and I think, and that basically in the short run, we're going to get this new system in January. It's making some pretty big changes. That's going to have substantial impacts that can't really be predicted. And so I kind of think that there'll be a sort of mopping up exercise, I expect, over the next few years, as things happen that weren't quite expected, and the policymakers work out kind of what to do and how to adjust to that. But I think even in the longer term, migration policy actually is quite unstable. There isn't a single right answer. Kind of, this is the policy and it works now and it works forever, and this will make people happy. I think basically governments, including the UK, are pursuing a lot of different objectives, whether it's kind of economic, facilitating family unity, responding to concerns about migration. Some of those objectives conflict, and I think that the kind of the logic of that essentially is that you end up with a little bit of a pendulum. You kind of go one direction, people decide it's too much, you go the other direction. There's a kind of trial and error, because ultimately there isn't a single right way of doing it.
Okay, lovely. Thanks very much indeed. Well, as you know, academics are often very reluctant to make predictions, but you've seen it here first. An academic who's volunteered to make a prediction. Anyway, you can chalk it up and come back to it in 5 years' time. Madeline and Ben and Sunda, thank you very much indeed for an engaging discussion. I hope if nothing else you've witnessed this morning is you'll realise that although they're all coming from somewhat different perspectives, it is possible to have a rational, cool and considered discussion on a subject which often perhaps generates more heat than light. So thank you very much to all three of you. I have been asked to say that before you leave the session for your well-deserved 1 hour lunch break, and we do reconvene at 1:45, when you will get a chance to discuss amongst yourselves about how you reacted to what you heard this morning. But could you please, first of all, check in with your moderators before you leave your seats and go and find your lunch, so that they can just check in with you before we all go into the lunch session. But thank you all for listening. Thank you again to our speakers. I hope you've enjoyed the morning, and I hope you will then look forward to the afternoon when you'll get a chance to talk about what we've heard, and then we'll move on to another equally important subject, which is what food should we eat and how should we acquire it. So we move on to that other crucial Brexit subject during the course of this afternoon. Many thanks indeed.